They had already tied the rope before anyone bothered asking whether the old cowboy was innocent. The sun hung low over Red Mesa, bleeding orange light across the dusty street, while 30 angry townsfolk gathered outside the sheriff's office with the kind of silence that came before something ugly. Gideon Vale stood beneath the hanging beam with his wrists bound in front of him, his gray beard stirring lightly in the dry evening wind. He looked older than the town remembered. Smaller, too. The years had bent his shoulders and carved deep lines into his face like old riverbeds through desert stone. But his eyes stayed calm. That was what unsettled people most. Not fear. Not anger. Calm. Sheriff Tom Avery wiped sweat from beneath his hat for the 5th time in as many minutes. The rope beside him creaked softly whenever the wind shifted. Nobody spoke above a murmur now. They just stared at Gideon like men staring at a coffin before burial. A few women stood near the general store porch clutching shawls around their shoulders, while boys no older than 14 lingered near the water trough pretending not to watch. "He sold us out," someone muttered near the saloon steps. Another voice answered, "Always knew there was something wrong with him." Gideon heard every word. He simply lowered his eyes toward the dirt. 20 years earlier, those same people had called him a war hero. 20 years earlier, Gideon Vale had ridden cavalry through Apache country with a rifle across his back and a flag stitched onto his coat sleeve. But wars changed men. Some came home louder. Others came home quieter. Gideon had returned carrying silence like a second shadow. The accusation spread through town 3 nights ago after the Baxter Gold convoy disappeared near Black Ridge Canyon. 5 guards missing. Wagons burned. Horses gone. Tracks leading south toward Apache territory. And 1 old drunk rancher seen nearby before sunrise. That was enough for Red Mesa. Enough for frightened men looking for somebody to blame before fear turned inward. "Say something," Sheriff Avery whispered under his breath as he stepped closer to Gideon. "Give me anything to stop this." Gideon slowly looked up at him. His voice came rough like dry boots scraping wood. "Wouldn't matter now." The sheriff swallowed hard. Because deep down he knew the old cowboy was right. The crowd did not want truth. Truth moved too slow. Truth asked questions people feared answering. What they wanted was punishment. Simple. Fast. Public. A ranch hand named Ellis Crow shoved forward through the crowd holding a lantern high despite the fading daylight. "Sun's dropping," he barked. "Either hang him now or admit this town's too scared to protect itself." Murmurs spread immediately. Angry agreement. Nervous shifting. Boots scraping dust. Gideon lifted his eyes toward the horizon one final time. The desert beyond town stretched wide and empty beneath the dying light. Mesquite trees stood black against the hills. Buzzards circled somewhere far away. Then suddenly, from the edge of town, came the slow rhythm of hoofbeats. 1 horse. Not hurried. Not cautious. Just steady. Every head turned toward the sound. Out beyond the feed store, a lone rider emerged through the drifting dust with the setting sun burning behind him like fire through smoke. He wore no soldier's coat. No sheriff's badge. No rifle rested in his hands. Only a long Apache cloak moved softly against the horse's flanks as he rode straight down the center of town without slowing once. The crowd parted instinctively. Not because they were told to, because something about the man demanded space before he even spoke. Sheriff Avery's face drained pale. One of the older women near the porch crossed herself quietly. Gideon's tired eyes narrowed beneath his hat brim as the rider finally stopped 20 feet from the gallows. The Apache chief climbed down from his horse slowly, dust falling from his boots onto the silent street. Deep scars crossed one side of his weathered face, and silver threaded through the braids hanging beside his shoulders. His eyes moved across the crowd first, then toward Gideon, long enough for the entire town to stop breathing. Finally, the chief spoke in a calm voice that carried through every corner of Red Mesa. "Don't hang him yet," he said. "I rode 200 miles to decide that myself." The desert wind moved quietly through Red Mesa after the chief spoke, but nobody in town seemed willing to breathe too loudly anymore. The evening air carried the smell of dust, horse sweat, and lantern oil drifting from the saloon windows across the street. Sheriff Avery stood frozen beside the hanging post with one hand still resting near the rope while the Apache chief slowly removed his gloves one finger at a time. Nobody missed the calm in that movement. Men expecting trouble usually moved fast. Dangerous men moved slowly. Gideon Vale watched from beneath the brim of his weathered hat without saying a word. He recognized the chief immediately now that the sunlight hit his face clean. Time had changed him, but not enough. The scars were new. The silver in his braids was new. But the eyes remained the same dark, steady eyes Gideon remembered from long ago beside a frozen creek in Apache country. Chief Nantan finally stepped closer, boots pressing softly into the dirt street. The crowd shifted backward almost as one body. Ellis Crow tightened his grip around the lantern handle and tried to sound braver than he felt. "This is town business," he muttered. "Not yours." Nantan looked at him only briefly. A man's life becomes everyone's business when fear starts deciding guilt. The words landed heavily in the silence. Somewhere behind the general store, a loose shutter knocked softly against wood in the wind. Gideon lowered his tired eyes again. He had spent the last 12 years living alone nearly 40 miles north of Red Mesa, where the desert flattened into dry cattle land and forgotten hills. Most folks in town had not seen the old ranch in years. They only knew stories now. Stories about the old cavalryman who stopped attending church. Stories about the cowboy who never joined posses anymore whenever Apache raids were rumored nearby. Stories about the man who once threw a drunken ranch owner off his property for insulting an Apache woman at his dinner table. People remembered moments like that out here, especially when times turned hard. Gideon had once been respected, the kind of man other riders followed naturally through storms or cattle drives. But war had worn something thin inside him. After the border campaigns ended, he stopped carrying himself like a hero. He sold most of his herd, buried his wife beneath a cottonwood tree overlooking the creek near his cabin, and slowly disappeared from town life piece by piece. Some men believed grief made him weak. Others whispered something darker, that maybe he had spent too much time among Apache tribes during the war, that maybe he had forgotten which side he belonged to. The rumors worsened after he refused to help Sheriff Avery track young Apache riders accused of stealing horses last winter. "I am done chasing boys into graves," Gideon had said quietly back then. Red Mesa never forgave him for that sentence. Not fully. Nantan stopped directly in front of the old cowboy now. Their eyes met beneath the fading orange light. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The crowd watched carefully, waiting for anger, accusation, recognition, anything at all. Instead, Nantan studied the rope around Gideon's wrists like it offended him personally. "You look smaller," the chief finally said. A faint breath escaped Gideon that almost resembled a laugh. "That tends to happen after 60. A few uneasy chuckles spread through the crowd before dying quickly. Nobody wanted comfort yet. Sheriff Avery cleared his throat carefully. "Chief Nantan, if you know something about the convoy attack, now would be the time." Nantan turned slowly toward him. "I know this," he said calmly. "The men who burned those wagons wanted this town angry before the bodies were even cold." Ellis Crow frowned. "How would you know that?" The chief's eyes moved back toward Gideon. "Because the same men tried to start this war 25 years ago." A cold silence settled over Red Mesa again. Even the horses tied outside the saloon seemed restless now, shifting against their reins while the last sunlight bled slowly across the street like fire sinking beneath the desert horizon. The light faded fast after Chief Nantan spoke those words, and suddenly the whole town of Red Mesa felt colder than the desert had any right to be in late summer. Lanterns flickered awake one by one along the saloon porch and outside the barber shop while long shadows stretched across the dirt street like dark fingers reaching between boots and wagon wheels. Nobody moved toward Gideon anymore. The anger that had filled the square only minutes earlier had begun changing shape. Anger was simple. Doubt was heavier. Sheriff Avery loosened his collar slowly as dust rolled across the road in soft waves around his boots. "What men?" he finally asked. "Who are you talking about?" Nantan did not answer immediately. Instead, He stepped past the hanging post and looked toward the western edge of town, where the Baxter mining office stood dark against the dying sky. Its windows reflected the last orange light like pieces of fire trapped behind glass. "Men who grow rich whenever fear spreads faster than truth," the chief said quietly. "Men who need Apache raids because war keeps land cheap and frightened people obedient." Ellis Crow scoffed loudly from beside the saloon hitching rail. Convenient story coming from an Apache chief. Several men nodded at that, grateful for something familiar to hold on to again. Familiar hatred felt safer than uncertainty. But Nantan merely turned toward Ellis with the same calm expression. "Tell me something then," he said. "If Apache riders burned the convoy, why were the wagon locks untouched?" The question hung in the air. Ellis frowned. Sheriff Avery looked up sharply. "What?" Nantan folded his gloves slowly into his belt. "I visited the canyon before coming here. 5 wagons burned. Gold missing. But every lockbox remained neatly opened with keys." His eyes swept across the crowd carefully. "Apache raiders do not carry bank keys." The murmurs started immediately after that. Quiet at first. Nervous. Men glancing sideways at one another beneath hat brims. Gideon remained silent beneath the hanging beam while the sheriff's face slowly tightened. "Nobody mentioned opened lockboxes," Avery said carefully. "Only Baxter men saw the sight before town riders arrived." Nantan nodded once. "Exactly." The sheriff looked suddenly uncomfortable now, as if pieces of a puzzle he never wanted assembled had begun sliding together against his will. Gideon finally lifted his voice for the first time in several minutes. "How many guards were really killed?" The question came low and steady. Sheriff Avery hesitated too long before answering. 3 bodies found." A sharp silence followed. Gideon's tired eyes narrowed. "Not 5. Avery swallowed. "No." Ellis Crow stepped forward immediately, pointing toward Gideon with growing desperation. "He was still there near the canyon. Folks saw him." "I was there," Gideon answered calmly, "because somebody left a dying horse half a mile from my northern fence line." Several people exchanged uneasy looks. Gideon slowly turned his gaze toward the crowd. The saddle carried Baxter mining stamps. "I followed the tracks south thinking somebody needed help." His weathered face hardened slightly beneath the lantern glow. "What I found looked less like an Apache raid and more like theater." Nobody interrupted him now. Even Ellis stayed quiet. Gideon looked toward Sheriff Avery. "Burn marks too neat. Supply crates untouched. Tracks circling twice to make the numbers look bigger." He paused briefly. "Whoever did it wanted witnesses to believe a war party came through." The sheriff rubbed a trembling hand across his jaw. "Then why not say this 3 days ago?" Gideon gave a tired smile that never reached his eyes. "Because nobody in this town wanted explanations." A dry wind swept through the square hard enough to stir coats and lantern flames at once. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled faintly beyond the mountains. Nantan stepped beside Gideon now, close enough for the crowd to finally understand something that unsettled them even more than the chief's arrival. The old cowboy was not afraid of him. Not even a little. 25 years ago, Nantan said quietly, another mining company blamed Apache tribes for attacks they created themselves. His eyes settled heavily on the Baxter office again. And a young cavalry scout discovered the truth before they could start a war. Slowly, almost unwillingly, the town's attention turned toward Gideon Vale. The wind picked up harder after dark, carrying dust through the narrow street of Red Mesa, while lantern flames trembled beneath the saloon awning. Nobody had gone home yet. Fear kept people rooted where they stood, and fear had changed shape again. Earlier that evening, they had gathered for a hanging. Now they stood listening to old ghosts crawl back into town through the mouths of 2 men who remembered too much. Sheriff Avery finally motioned toward the jailhouse porch. "Cut him loose," he said quietly to the deputy beside him. The young deputy hesitated, not because he disagreed, because 30 armed townsfolk were watching him decide whether the accused man deserved rope or respect. Gideon noticed the hesitation immediately. "Leave it," he muttered. Rope does not weigh much after a while. Nantan turned toward him sharply at that. For the first time since arriving, something flickered across the chief's scarred face. Not anger. Sadness. Brief and heavy. Then it vanished. Ellis Crow spat into the dirt. "This is madness," he snapped. "You all letting an Apache chief walk in here and rewrite facts? Facts do not change because you fear them," Nantan answered calmly. Ellis stepped closer, lantern swinging beside his leg. "3 men are dead. And whoever arranged it expected this town to stop asking questions after hanging an old cowboy." The words landed like stones in still water. Sheriff Avery looked toward the Baxter office again, jaw tightening. Everybody in Red Mesa knew the Baxters owned half the valley now. Silver contracts, freight routes, rail deals. They lent money when crops failed and took land when payments missed. Folks feared them almost as much as drought. Gideon slowly lifted his bound wrists and rubbed the rope marks against his coat sleeve. "You remember Samuel Baxter?" he asked quietly without looking at anyone in particular. Several older men nodded uneasily near the hitching posts. Gideon stared toward the dark horizon beyond town. "Back in '71, he paid riders to attack supply camps outside Apache territory." A murmur spread again. Gideon continued before anyone could interrupt. "Then he sold protection contracts to frighten settlements after the panic started." Ellis shook his head immediately. "That is hearsay." "No," Nantan said softly. "It is history." The chief stepped forward. Into the lantern glow now, and for the first time the crowd noticed how old he truly looked. Not weak, just weathered by years that had carved patience into his face deeper than scars ever could. "I was 12 winters old when my father discovered Baxter rifles hidden near Dry Creek Canyon," he said. "Rifles meant to be found by cavalry scouts." Sheriff Avery frowned slowly. "To frame Apache tribes." Nantan nodded once. "A war creates profit. Fear creates loyalty. Dead men cannot deny stories told about them." The town grew quieter with every sentence. Even Ellis Crow seemed uncertain now, though pride kept his jaw tight. Gideon finally looked toward the chief directly. "Your father wanted to expose Baxter publicly." Nantan's eyes darkened slightly. "And men died before sunrise." The silence after that sentence felt endless. Wind rolled through the street carrying the smell of rain somewhere far beyond the mesas. Sheriff Avery removed his hat slowly and ran tired fingers through thinning hair. "Why come now after 25 years?" he asked. Nantan looked toward Gideon before answering. "Because the same pattern returned." He pointed toward the Baxter office. "A staged raid. Missing gold. Apache tracks too obvious to be real." Then his voice lowered. "And one old cowboy standing close enough to become convenient." Gideon gave a faint, bitter smile at that. "Convenient has followed me a long time." A sudden clap of thunder rolled louder across the distant hills, making several horses shift nervously against their reins. One of the women near the general store finally spoke for the first time all evening. "If Gideon did not do this," her voice trembled softly, "then who did?" Nobody answered immediately, but across the street, inside the second-floor window of the dark Baxter office, a curtain moved slightly before becoming still again. Nantan noticed it first. His eyes narrowed almost invisibly toward the glass. Then he spoke quietly enough that only Gideon heard him. "We are being watched." Rain finally arrived just after midnight. Not a storm yet. Just slow drops tapping against rooftops and wooden signs while Red Mesa sat awake beneath a sky thick with dark clouds. Most of the townsfolk had drifted home hours earlier, but sleep had not followed them. Lanterns still glowed behind curtains up and down the street. Fear did that to people. Once doubt entered a town, it moved through walls like smoke. Gideon sat inside the small jail cell near the back of Sheriff Avery's office with his hat resting low over tired eyes. The ropes had finally been removed, though the deputy had done it without meeting his gaze. Across the room, Sheriff Avery leaned over his desk studying old freight reports beside a flickering oil lamp while Chief Nantan stood silently near the window, watching rain slide down the glass. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Only the soft ticking of water dripping from the roof outside filled the room. Then Gideon finally broke the silence. "You should not have come here alone." Nantan kept his eyes on the dark street beyond the window. "If I rode with warriors, this town would hear only fear." Gideon gave a faint nod at that. He understood. Out here, truth often arrived too quietly for frightened people to recognize it. Avery rubbed both hands across his face heavily. "You said this happened before," he muttered. 25 years ago." Nantan turned slowly from the window. "Yes." The chief stepped closer into the lantern light, and for the first time that night, something softer entered his voice. "My father believed peace was possible with settlements like this one." His eyes moved briefly toward Gideon. "Most warriors did not." Gideon stared at the floorboards quietly, already knowing where the story would lead before the chief spoke another word. "There was a trading camp near Dry Creek," Nantan continued. "Your railroad men wanted Apache land opened for silver transport routes." Rain tapped harder against the roof now, steady and hollow. Sheriff Avery listened without moving. "One night," Nantan said softly, "someone attacked the camp wearing Apache paint stolen from dead warriors." Avery frowned. "To start retaliation." "Yes." The chief folded his weathered hands slowly behind his back. "By sunrise, frightened towns demanded soldiers. Soldiers demanded targets." His voice lowered slightly. "And my father discovered proof before the army could move." Gideon closed his eyes briefly beneath the brim of his hat. Memories moved across his face like shadows passing over old stone. "You were there," Avery realized quietly. Gideon nodded once. "Scouting detail." The sheriff leaned back slowly in his chair. "What proof?" Nantan looked toward Gideon instead of answering himself. The old cowboy spoke carefully, each word slow and dry as desert wind. "Freight invoices. Army ammunition sold privately to Baxter contractors. Apache arrows planted afterward to hide it." Avery stared at him. "You never told anyone?" Gideon finally looked up, and something old and heavy sat behind his tired eyes now. "I tried." The room fell silent again. Outside, thunder rolled closer through the mountains. Gideon leaned back against the cell wall slowly, while the lantern light danced across the deep lines in his weathered face. 3 days after I found those papers," he said quietly, "the trading camp burned completely." Nantan lowered his head slightly. "My father died that same week." Sheriff Avery swallowed hard. "And Baxter buried the story." Gideon nodded once more. "Along with anyone who talked too loudly." Rainwater dripped steadily from the brim of Nantan's cloak onto the wooden floor, while the chief stared silently at the old cowboy across the room. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above the rain. "You could have walked away back then." Gideon gave a tired smile that carried no pride inside it. "I almost did." The chief studied him carefully for several long seconds before continuing. "But instead you carried a wounded Apache boy 6 miles through snow after soldiers attacked our winter camp." Avery looked between them slowly now, beginning to understand something larger than freight robberies or missing gold. Gideon sighed quietly. "You remember too much." "No," Nantan answered softly. "I remember exactly enough." Another flash of lightning illuminated the room through the rain-streaked window for one brief second. And in that white burst of light, Sheriff Avery finally saw the truth both men had carried into Red Mesa that night. The old cowboy had not saved an Apache chief. He had saved a frightened child long before either of them became who they were now. By dawn the rain had stopped, but Red Mesa looked different beneath the pale gray morning sky. Mud clung to wagon wheels. Water dripped slowly from porch roofs. The usual sounds of the town waking up felt quieter somehow, like people feared making noise before learning what kind of day this would become. Gideon stood outside the sheriff's office with a wool blanket over his shoulders while Deputy Miller cut fresh coffee beans inside the jailhouse kitchen. Nobody had tied his hands again. Nobody had apologized either. Across the street, Baxter Mining office remained dark and shuttered despite the early hour. That alone bothered Sheriff Avery more than he admitted aloud. Men with money usually rushed to defend themselves. Silence meant planning. Nantan stood near the horse trough rinsing rainwater from his hands, while several townsfolk watched him carefully from a distance. Children stared openly. Adults pretended not to. Gideon slowly stepped beside the chief, boots sinking slightly into the wet dirt. "You should leave before noon," he muttered quietly. "Once Baxter hears people are questioning the convoy story, things will turn ugly fast." Nantan looked toward the eastern hills where sunlight struggled through heavy clouds. "I did not ride here to run." Gideon gave a tired nod. He expected that answer already. Sheriff Avery pushed open the office door carrying a stack of weathered freight papers beneath one arm. His face looked pale from lack of sleep. "You were right," he said without greeting either man. "The numbers do not match." Gideon glanced toward the papers. "How bad?" Avery exhaled heavily. "Convoy manifest claims 42 gold bars shipped from Silver Junction." He handed one document toward Gideon. But railroad intake reports from 3 days earlier only logged 27. Nantan's expression darkened slightly. 15 bars missing before the convoy ever left. Avery nodded once. "Meaning somebody planned theft before the attack happened." The sheriff lowered his voice carefully after that. "And there is something else." He unfolded a smaller paper stained. "From years of folding and travel. Baxter recently hired 6 outside guards from Tucson, none of them listed with territorial law offices." Gideon studied the names briefly before his jaw tightened. "These are not guards." Avery frowned. "You know them." Gideon handed the paper back slowly. "Men like this drift wherever fear pays best." The morning wind carried the distant creak of signs swinging gently above empty storefronts. Red Mesa had grown quieter again. Even the saloon piano remained silent this morning. Folks sensed something larger moving beneath the surface now. Ellis Crow appeared from the feed store carrying a rifle over one shoulder before stopping when he noticed Gideon standing freely beside the sheriff. Suspicion immediately hardened his face. "So that is it?" He snapped loudly enough for nearby townsfolk to hear. "Old stories from Apache country wipe away dead men and stolen gold?" Sheriff Avery stepped forward. "Nobody said that." Ellis pointed toward Nantan angrily. "This town is being manipulated." Nantan met his glare without raising his voice. "By fear, yes." Ellis shook his head bitterly. "You all expect us to trust him over our own people?" Gideon answered before anyone else could speak. "Your own people nearly hanged an innocent man yesterday before supper." The words struck harder than shouting would have. Several men standing near the barber shop lowered their eyes immediately. Ellis opened his mouth to answer, but stopped when an older woman named Clara Whitmore stepped onto her porch across the street. "My husband died in the border wars," she said quietly. Every head turned toward her. "And before he passed, he told me the worst men he ever met wore polished boots instead of war paint." Silence followed her words like dust settling after wind. Ellis looked suddenly smaller standing there in the muddy street. Gideon watched him carefully, not with anger but something sadder. He had seen this before. Good people clinging to hatred because admitting they were wrong felt heavier than carrying fear. Then suddenly Deputy Miller burst out from the sheriff's office holding another paper in shaking hands. "Sheriff," he breathed, "you need to see this." Avery took the paper quickly, eyes narrowing as he read. "What is it?" Gideon asked. The sheriff looked slowly toward Baxter Mining office across the street. "One of the missing convoy guards just checked into the boarding house an hour ago." A cold silence spread immediately across the muddy street. "Alive?" Gideon asked quietly. Avery nodded once. "And according to Mrs. Doyle," he said carefully. He seemed terrified somebody would find him first. The boarding house smelled like wet wood, burnt coffee, and old tobacco when Sheriff Avery pushed through the front door with Gideon and Nantan close behind him. Rainwater still dripped slowly from the roof outside while nervous whispers floated through the narrow hallway upstairs. Mrs. Doyle stood near the staircase wringing her hands in her apron, her pale face somehow saying more than words ever could. "Room 7, she whispered. "He locked himself inside after sunrise. Has not come out since." Avery nodded once and started up the stairs carefully. Every step groaned beneath his boots. Gideon followed slower, one hand brushing the railing worn smooth by years of travelers passing through Red Mesa chasing gold, work, or somewhere to disappear. Nantan climbed behind them in complete silence. The hallway upstairs felt close and stale, heavy with the smell of damp wallpaper and storm air trapped overnight. Room 7 sat near the far end with weak light glowing beneath the door. Sheriff Avery stopped outside it and knocked twice. "This is Sheriff Avery," he called calmly. "Nobody here wants trouble." Silence answered him at first. Then finally, a rough voice came from inside. "You alone?" Avery glanced toward Gideon and Nantan briefly before answering. No, another silence followed. Longer this time. Then the lock slowly turned. The man inside looked exhausted before he even spoke. Mid-30s, maybe. Unshaven. Dark circles beneath frightened eyes. A bandage wrapped loosely around one shoulder beneath his coat. He froze immediately when he saw Nantan standing behind Gideon in the hallway. Fear flashed across his face so quickly he could not hide it. "No," he whispered. "No, this was not part of it." Gideon noticed those words instantly. Part of what? The man stepped backward into the room like he wanted distance from his own thoughts. Sheriff Avery closed the door behind them carefully, while morning light filtered through thin curtains onto dusty floorboards. A half-packed travel bag sat open beside the bed. The man had planned to run again. "Name," Avery said firmly. "Carter Hayes." The sheriff nodded slowly. "You were listed as convoy security." Carter swallowed hard. "Yeah." Gideon leaned against the wall, quietly studying him. "You do not look like a man who survived an Apache raid." Carter's eyes flicked toward Nantan again before dropping quickly. "Because there was no Apache raid." Nobody moved after that sentence. Outside, distant thunder rolled softly beyond the hills again. Carter sat heavily on the edge of the bed with shaking hands pressed together between his knees. "We were told it would be simple," he muttered. "Scare the territory. Blame the tribes. Make settlers desperate for protection contracts." Sheriff Avery's face hardened slowly. "Who told you?" Carter hesitated. Fear moved visibly through him now like cold water under skin. "Mr. Baxter's people." Gideon closed his eyes briefly. The old patterns again. Same greed. Different year. Carter rubbed both hands across his face roughly. "The gold was already gone before the convoy left Silver Junction. We just burned empty wagons and spread tracks through the canyon." Avery stared at him in disbelief. "3 men still died." Carter nodded miserably. "Because somebody panicked." His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Once folks started asking questions, Baxter decided loose ends were dangerous." Nantan stepped closer now, calm but unreadable. "So you ran." Carter looked at the chief carefully, confused by the absence of anger in his face. "I thought they would blame your people completely," he admitted quietly. "I did not know they planned hanging somebody by sundown." Gideon gave a tired laugh with no humor inside it. Fear moves fast in small towns. Carter slowly reached into his coat pocket after that, making Avery tense instinctively. But the man only removed a folded paper stained by rain and sweat. "I took this before leaving the canyon." Avery unfolded it carefully beneath the window light. His eyes widened almost immediately. Freight signatures, payment ledgers, Baxter Company seals, names, dates, numbers matching missing gold shipments stretching back almost 8 years. Gideon looked toward the sheriff quietly. "That is enough to bury half the valley." Avery nodded faintly, still staring at the page. But before anyone spoke again, footsteps suddenly thundered across the porch downstairs. Fast, heavy. Then came shouting from the street below. Mrs. Doyle screamed, and through the boarding house window, Gideon saw 6 armed riders pulling hard on their reins outside beneath the gray morning sky. The sound of horses outside the boarding house rolled through the floorboards like distant thunder, heavy and deliberate. Nobody inside room 7 moved at first. Carter Hayes had already gone pale before Sheriff Avery even reached the window. Gideon stepped closer beside him and looked down into the muddy street below where 6 riders sat mounted beneath long dark coats still damp from the morning rain. None wore badges. None needed to. Men like that carried authority differently. The lead rider tilted his hat back slightly, revealing sharp features and polished boots untouched by mud despite the storm. Gideon recognized him immediately. "Dawson Pike," he muttered quietly. Sheriff Avery frowned. "Baxter's fixer." Nantan remained perfectly still near the door, watching the riders through narrow eyes. Down below, townsfolk had already begun drifting back into the street, drawn by the same instinct that always pulled people toward danger and secrets. Curtains shifted open above storefronts. Saloon doors creaked. Fear had returned to Red Mesa again, only now it wore expensive coats instead of Apache paint. Carter backed farther away from the window until his legs struck the bed frame. "They are here for me." Gideon glanced toward him briefly. "No," he answered calmly. "They are here for the paper." Down in the street, Dawson Pike slowly dismounted and handed his reins to one of the other men before stepping toward the boarding house entrance with unsettling calm. He did not move like a man worried about resistance. He moved like somebody accustomed to owning outcomes before conversations even started. Sheriff Avery slipped the freight ledger inside his coat immediately. "Nobody speaks unless necessary," he warned quietly. Then the footsteps started on the stairs below. Slow, controlled, heavy enough for everyone upstairs to count them. One step at a time. Carter's breathing turned shallow. Gideon noticed it and rested one weathered hand briefly on the younger man's shoulder. "Stand straight," he said softly. "Fear feeds men like him." The footsteps stopped outside room 7. Then came 3 slow knocks against the door. Nantan stepped forward before Avery could move. The chief opened the door calmly. Dawson Pike stood there smiling faintly beneath cold gray eyes. His gaze swept across the room carefully before settling on Gideon. "Interesting company you keep these days," he said smoothly. Gideon leaned against the wall without answering. Pike's eyes shifted toward Carter next. "You disappeared before collecting your final payment." Carter lowered his gaze immediately. Pike sighed almost sadly. "That hurts my feelings." Sheriff Avery stepped between them slightly. "This is official business now." Pike barely acknowledged him. "Sheriff, you are standing inside a misunderstanding that can still be corrected peacefully." His voice stayed polite, but something colder moved beneath every word. Nantan watched him carefully. Peace built on lies never lasts long. Pike finally turned toward the Apache chief fully. For the first time, the faint smile disappeared. And yet lies built this territory. Silence settled heavily across the room after that. Rainwater dripped somewhere outside while the old boarding house creaked softly around them. Pike looked toward Gideon again. "You should have stayed forgotten, old man." Gideon gave a tired shrug. "I tried." Pike slowly removed a folded document from inside his coat. "Baxter Mining is prepared to pay generously for the safe return of company property and a quiet ending to all this confusion." Sheriff Avery's jaw tightened. "You mean bribery?" Pike ignored him. "Completely. This town needs jobs more than stories from 25 years ago." Then his eyes moved toward Nantan. "And your people need peace more than another territorial investigation." The room grew very still after that, because everybody understood the threat hidden beneath those careful words. Not guns. Not violence. Something older. Power. Money. Fear. The same poison Red Mesa had swallowed for years without noticing. Gideon slowly stepped away from the wall now. His joints cracked softly with age as he moved closer to Pike until only a few feet separated them. The old cowboy looked smaller than the younger man. Older. Worn thin by years and weather and regret. But when Gideon finally spoke, his voice carried through the room harder than anybody expected. "You know what men like Baxter always forget?" Pike's expression cooled slightly. Gideon glanced once toward the muddy street outside where townsfolk watched nervously below. Fear works best before people realize they almost killed the wrong man. For the first time since arriving, uncertainty flickered briefly across Dawson Pike's face. The silence after Gideon spoke felt heavier than any threat Dawson Pike could have carried into that room. Outside the boarding house window, Red Mesa stood frozen beneath a pale afternoon sky, while muddy water dripped slowly from porch roofs into the empty street below. Townsfolk watched from a distance now, not with anger anymore, but with the uneasy stillness of people beginning to understand how close they had come to becoming something ugly. Dawson Pike studied Gideon for several long seconds before his expression hardened again beneath the clean brim of his hat. "You think truth changes anything?" he asked quietly. Gideon looked tired more than angry. "No," he answered, "but sometimes it slows men down long enough to see themselves clearly." Sheriff Avery removed the freight ledger from inside his coat then and held it up where Pike could see the Baxter seals stamped across the pages. The room seemed to shrink slightly after that. Pike's eyes settled on the paper, and for the first time since entering, he stopped looking confident. Not afraid. Men like Dawson. Pike forgot how to fear ordinary things a long time ago, but he understood consequences. Avery stepped forward slowly. "It is over," the sheriff said. Pike gave a faint, bitter smile. "Nothing is ever over out here." Then he looked toward Carter Hayes sitting silently near the bed. "You should have kept riding." Carter lowered his eyes. "I got tired." Pike almost laughed at that. Not mockingly. More like a man hearing the truth too late to use it himself. Outside, more townsfolk had gathered quietly along the street. Clara Whitmore stood near the general store porch beside Ellis Crow now. Neither spoke. Across town, church bells rang softly through the damp afternoon air, slow and hollow across the valley. Dawson Pike finally straightened his coat and moved toward the door without another argument. He paused only once beside Nantan. "You saved the wrong town," he muttered. Nantan's expression never changed. "No," the chief answered softly. "I came for the right man." Pike left after that. No gunfire. No showdown. Just boots fading slowly down the hallway while the old boarding house creaked around the weight of another secret finally collapsing. An hour later, Baxter Mining Office stood locked under territorial orders, while Sheriff Avery sent riders toward Silver Junction carrying copies of the ledger beneath oilskin wraps. Nobody celebrated. Red Mesa did not feel victorious. Felt ashamed. The kind of shame that arrives quietly after fear leaves a room. By sunset, the clouds finally broke apart above the desert, spilling long golden light across the valley floor. Gideon stood alone beside the horse trough outside the sheriff's office, adjusting the saddle straps on his old gray horse. The town moved carefully around him now. Men tipped hats awkwardly. Women lowered their eyes. Nobody mentioned the rope from yesterday. Some things weighed too much once spoken aloud. Nantan approached slowly from across the street with the evening wind moving softly through the silver threaded into his braids. For a moment neither man spoke. They simply stood listening to distant cattle lowing somewhere beyond town while the desert cooled beneath the fading sun. Finally Gideon broke the silence. "You rode 200 miles for an old fool." Nantan looked toward the horizon where the last light burned red against the mesas. "No," he said quietly. "I rode for the cavalry scout who carried a frightened Apache boy through snow while soldiers searched the hills behind him." Gideon smiled faintly beneath his weathered beard. "That boy became stubborn. So did the scout." The old cowboy nodded once at that. Then his expression softened into something thoughtful. "Why come alone?" Nantan rested one hand against his horse's neck before answering. "Because warriors change fear into panic." His dark eyes moved briefly toward the quiet town around them. "But one man walking calmly into hatred." He paused gently. "Sometimes that reminds people they still have a choice." The evening wind carried dust softly across the empty street while church bells echoed one final time through Red Mesa. Gideon watched the chief climb into the saddle slowly beneath the dying light. No crowd gathered now. No threats remained. Only silence and the strange ache left behind when truth finally arrived after years of being unwelcome. Nantan turned his horse toward the western trail without another word. Gideon stood there watching until both rider and horse became shadows against the burning horizon. And long after the chief disappeared into the desert, The people of Red Mesa remembered the part that haunted them most. Not the missing gold, not the lies, not even the rope waiting beneath the hanging beam. It was the fact that the only man willing to defend the old cowboy had once been the child their fear would never have spared.